Is democracy in peril? Surely you've asked yourself this question, or some version of it in the past decade, but maybe even more recently as you've been banging your head against the wall while watching the elections. You, and probably everyone else, has this underlying feeling that democracy is not the same as it once was. Well, today you're going to hear from several experts, including Robert Lieberman, Jedediah Purdy, Anne Applebaum, Andrew Sullivan, Rory Stewart, and Barbara Walter to help you answer this question. Welcome to Democracy Discourse. I'm Brandon Stover, and I'm going to be your learning guide through Democracy Discourse. Now, this is not your standard course, one where I'm talking to you, instructing you the entire time, and you never give me any feedback about how you actually want to be learning. I want to hear from you about what it is that you want to learn in democracy. I want to have a conversation, a discourse, if you will, about what sort of questions are most salient to you around democracy. So to help with this process, as you watch this video and questions start to arise, please leave them in the comments below. And when the lesson is over, I want you to go over to our community tab on the channel and vote in our poll about what lesson you would like to learn next. By leaving comments, ones that I'm going to actually read, and voting in our poll, you can help to shape the direction of this course to make sure that you're actually learning what it is that you want to know about democracy most. Now, before we get to today's lesson, I want to introduce you to Louisa, which is the AI voice that I'll be using to help introduce certain speakers in all of our lessons and giving you prompts to periodically reflect on some of the material happening in the lesson. So Louisa, please introduce yourself and then introduce our first speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm Louisa. I'll be helping Brandon with Democracy Discourse. The content we will be sharing with you today comes from the great guests we have had on the Democracy Group podcasts and lectures given at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State. Our first speaker today is Robert Lieberman, professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. He's going to quickly define what democracy is so we all start on the same page.
What we mean by democracy is a system of representative government that is organized around competitive elections that provide an opportunity for citizens to hold office holders, those in power, accountable. As we describe it in the book, that has what we call four pillars, four things that have to be in place in order for democracy to really be robust. So I'll mention them quickly and then run through each of them. Free and fair elections, the rule of law, the idea of a legitimate opposition, and what we call the integrity of rights. So by free and fair elections, we mean just that, elections in which voting rights are widespread, in which votes are counted equally, in which access to the ballot is widespread, and in which there's no fraud or, we can be confident that the results that are reported are actually the way people voted. The rule of law is the idea that being in power doesn't give you special privileges, that the law applies equally to everyone, and that it's impossible, or at least very difficult, for people in power to use their position of power to tilt the playing field in their favor or to evade the law. The idea of a legitimate opposition is an interesting one, something that we found was a real challenge through much of American history. The idea that if you and I disagree about something, that makes us opponents, it makes us antagonists in an electoral setting, but we're not enemies, that we're all part of a common society with a common purpose. And even if we might have differences about how to achieve those purposes, we can disagree and compete in a democratic competition without being enemies. And then the integrity of rights refers to the protection of the rights that are really necessary for democratic politics to proceed. Civil rights, civil liberties, voting rights. These have to be widespread and well protected in order for democracy to be really robust.
But is democracy inevitable? How much do we take for granted that we live in a democracy? Legal scholar Jedediah Purdy and author Anne Applebaum believe democracy is not inevitable, and that believing that has caused part of the problem we are in today.
So, in the early 21st century, democracy seemed to be inevitable, but also largely superfluous. It was thought that history only had one direction. Everyone sort of said they didn't believe in the end of history, but everyone did kind of believe in the end of history. It was all going to end up in the same, basically, capitalist, individualist, loosely egalitarian, electoral but not very high stakes society of managed prosperity, and that would be good.
So it was easy to take for granted.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're now in a time when instead democracy feels essential, but also fraught, fragile, and dangerous. Dangerous because we've seen the kinds of threats and hostility that it can conjure up internally. Fragile because we've seen how easily aspects of it can be broken. I think what's easy to miss in this hyper-politicized time when everything indicates partisanship, from how you talk about gender to whether you wear a medical mask to where you live, what you drive, is that at the same time that we're asking more of politics and paying more attention to it, we're also haunted on all sides by a doubt that it will actually deliver or produce, that democracy is capable of choosing futures and establishing a common world among equals.
I think one of the great mistakes that we made over the last several decades was precisely that we believed this promise of inevitability. We believed that, democracy was a thing like running water, that you didn't have to do very much. You could just let some professional politicians do their jobs and you could get on with, making money or painting pictures or whatever it is that you wanted to do. And like running water coming out of a tap, you wouldn't have to make any special effort to make democracy work. This was a huge mistake. It's in some ways an understandable mistake because it reflected the experience of everybody who was alive at that time. At the time in 1989 or 1990, if you were living in the United States, or even if you were living in Europe, you had just lived through several decades of democratic success, not just American success, but the camp of American democracies. And you had seen one wave after the next of countries, having democratic revolutions, deciding to become democracies, for Southern Europe, then Eastern Europe, East Asia, South America, Africa, one region after the next followed in this path. And so, it was very natural to think in 1990 that this is just the way things are and the way they're always going to be. But this is, of course, not how the founding fathers of the United States thought, and they're not how anybody who's ever studied democracy very hard thought. If you go back and look at what the men who wrote the Constitution in 1789 were talking about, it's truly fascinating because they were very focused, fixated on ancient Greece and Rome. These were the democracies that they were using as models. And what they were particularly focused on was the era of the Roman Republic. So it wasn't about the Roman Empire. It was about the era of the Roman Republic and the fall of that republic. They understood that democracy was circular, or that politics is circular, history is circular, and things, nothing is inevitable, and there are no upward trajectories. And one of the reasons they designed our now somewhat rickety constitution the way they did was because they wanted there to be a balance of power. They didn't want the executive to be either too strong or too weak. And what they were thinking about all the time was how democracy had fallen in ancient Rome, how the people had become entranced by Caesar, the demagogue, and how the Roman Republic had lost its democratic essence. But their understanding was absolutely that democracy can fail. And they didn't have any doubts about that.
Recall the 4 pillars of democracy Robert presented earlier. I'll give you a moment to remember. Robert said those 4 pillars were free and fair elections, the rule of law, the idea of legitimate opposition, and integrity of rights. Do you believe those 4 pillars still hold strong today? Leave us a comment and tell us what you think. If not, how do democracies fail? How do we go from a thriving democracy to potentially collapsing? Andrew Sullivan, contributing editor at New York Magazine and former editor of the New Republic, walks us through how a democracy can become fertile soil for the rise of tyranny.
Democracy hasn't always been a good word. We think of it almost banal as obviously something that is good and important, a vital value. And one of the good things about a liberal education is that you get to read people from other eras and other ages. And it always struck me that when I was reading and invited to read Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, they didn't like democracy very much. And they had an understanding of democracy as something that's deeply unstable. The one thing they all agreed on, and the one thing they agreed on with the founders who studied them, was that democracies are fragile, and they do not last very long, and have not lasted in history very long. Liberal democracy, our particular version of democracy, has only existed for a tiny sliver of history, like maybe 200 years if you're really pushing it. And the entire rest of human history and culture has actually not been democratic. So why did Plato believe that democracies are unstable? Well, it's quite simple, really. Democracies are defined by a radical belief in equality. Equality of all kinds, equality in power, equality in ideas, equality in ways of life. Plato called it a multicolored cloak, full with many hues. He also said that if you had to pick of all the different kind of regimes to live in, and those are a monarchy, an aristocracy or an oligarchy, or democracy, you would always pick democracy. Because it's lovely living in a democracy. No one really bosses you around. Different ideas are constantly around. Equality extends throughout the culture. This is the culture in which teachers defer to students, in which there is no difference whatsoever between men and women, and they're taken to be interchangeable. That's what equality really means. It's where the government is actually filled, and the office is filled entirely by lottery, a really random sprinkling of the democratic society. And democracy is pleasant and has many appetites. Democracy is defined really by our letting our desires overtake our reason. So democracies tend to be full of wealth and greed and lust and food and all the things that we use to make ourselves feel better, even though we know back in our heads maybe it's not so great. And out of this extraordinary diversity of views, after a while, something begins to happen. Little inequalities begin to emerge, and people fight against them. Ways of life, in some quarters, become incompatible with other ways of life. Views are not just simply varied, but contradictory. And in such a democracy also at the same time, the wealthy essentially accept that they can't rule anymore. So what they're going to do is make lots of money. They're going to put their own private wealth and private interests above any interests in the public good. And the public good is to be looked after only insofar as it helps maintain their ability to make money. And of course, in a democracy, those who are making money, those who have more status and money than others, come under withering criticism from below. This is a varied, diverse, equal, thriving, but cacophonous place, with few restraints on its appetites, full of resentment of others doing better, pathologically devoted to the fundamental equality of absolutely every single person. And Plato says, when that begins to happen, when in fact these views and the diversity of people within this republic, all equal, not having power of each other, there tends to be gridlock, deadlock. These values are not compatible. How do we resolve these conflicts? And there also becomes resentment increasing of the wealthy, the people that somehow seem, through material goods, to be above this egalitarianism. And at that time, Plato says, usually something happens. Someone emerges, usually from the elites, who is full of the democratic temperament, full of desires, lacking self-control, pathological about food, constantly seeking sex, who realizes he has a moment. And the moment is for him to become a traitor to his own class, to actually accuse his fellow members of the elite of being corrupt, of being having too much authority and power, and violating the core principles of democracy. And if he finds, and this is Plato's words, a particularly obedient mob in that broad democracy, he can appeal to the people and say to the people, this chaos that you're living in, this constant deadlock of ideas and values, we can't go on like this. Nothing gets done. Nothing gets decided. And then he makes the argument that the wealthy and the elites are actually preventing those things getting done as well. And they need to be brought down. And he, as a member of elites, knows how to bring these people down. He knows the system. All he seeks is your mass support to take them down. Sounds a little familiar, but it's something that Plato says always happens in a democratic society. It can't really, in the end, govern itself. And in the end, it decides and gives itself up to a tyrant. And this is the only way tyranny comes about. When Plato and Aristotle talk about the changing of regimes, how kings can become tyrants, how, even though they tend to operate in the opposite direction, how aristocracies can become oligarchies, he's also aware that tyranny itself, popular, really powerful tyranny, comes from democracies and democracies alone. The founders understood this very well, in fact, obsessed about it. How, they wondered, could they get a democracy that actually worked, that wasn't short-lived, that didn't collapse under the weight of its own divisions? So they created what they believed to be a mixed regime with elements of democracy, elements of aristocracy, and even elements of monarchy in it. So that all these things can keep each other in balance and the thing has more stability. The core is the democratic will, but it's always tempered by elites, by structures, by institutions, by rules that slow the democratic will down, that give elites a chance to get into the process. And by any historical measures, they were incredibly successful. This is the longest running democratic experiment, explicitly as such, since the Roman Republic collapsed.
Andrew spoke about democracies being tempered by elites, those people entrusted to run the country on behalf of its people. However, some believe that those elites may not be able to do this job properly. Rory Stewart, a former member of the British Parliament for over a decade, thinks this may be the case.
The idea is that a particular group, pretty small group of people, they might be called senators, congresspeople, they could be called cabinet ministers, somehow are going to be able to govern these incredibly complex societies. That they're supposed to understand Iraq and Afghanistan, they're supposed to understand the intricacies of health policy, they're supposed to understand now AI, climate change. And the closer you get to who those people really are and how they actually spend their days and the things they're worrying about, the less plausible it is that this is a system which is likely to generate thoughtful, long-term policy. I think we live in a very dangerous age. I think Donald Trump is a symptom, not the driving cause. I think we live in an age where all those things that I've talked about, and particularly now the additional element of AI, create extremely rich, fertile soil for populism. It's not an accident that we can see Marine Le Pen in pole position to take over as president of France, or that the AfD is rising in Germany, or that we see all forms of left and right-wing populism spreading across Latin America. The fundamental driving force of this, of the narrative that you can speak for the people, an imagined people against the elite, not the majority of the people, but a people that you present as the real nation against the elite, that you can polarize and that you can generate extreme bullshit. I mean, sometimes it's lies, sometimes it's half-truths, sometimes it's just gross simplifications. These things remain absolute present dangers, and our systems, and this is partly what How Not to Be a Politician is about, the old-fashioned politicians are extremely poorly equipped to respond because our profession has become so saturated with media, so cynical, so tribal, so short-termist, that it's extremely difficult for us to present a dignified, moral response to populism. America is entering, even under Joe Biden, a phase of isolationism. It's no accident that we have had, under the Biden presidency, 7 coups in sub-Saharan Africa, that democracy is in reverse. This is not like the 90s and early 2000s where the number of democracies in the world was growing. They are diminishing. And President Biden is getting credit, rightly, for standing up to Russia and Ukraine. But the foreign policy for the middle class, I'm afraid, which is the strapline for all of this, if you look at the detail of it, has many things that traditionally we would have called isolationist. The US is no longer a confident global player. And despite all the horrors of Iraq and Afghanistan, when the US was a more confident global player in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, it was helping to make the world a slightly better place, and it's no longer doing that.
What else are the telltale signs of democracy's decline? First, we'll hear from Robert Lieberman again, as he describes the 4 threats he identified in his book 4 Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. Then we'll hear from political scientist Barbara F. Walter as she explains what a civil war in America would look like in present day.
Let's dive into the threats as you lay them out. They are political polarization, racial inequality, economic inequality, and executive aggrandizement.
These are threats that we know mostly from the study of comparative politics, from the study of the rise and fall of democracy elsewhere. These are things that we know are threatening to democracy or challenging for democracy or make democracy difficult to sustain. Polarization takes a number of forms. It's not just wide disagreement about policy or about what the government should do. That's part of it. But it also is a strategic phenomenon when elections are very closely fought and when there's a real sense that either side can win and could win a fair election. Then the incentive, the temptation to close ranks on each side, to think of politics as a team sport, and to prioritize winning, beating the other team over just about anything else, becomes paramount. And that's what we've seen repeatedly at a number of times in American history. So in the 1790s, these founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, who didn't really believe in parties, immediately found themselves in the government with very different ideas about policy and the direction the country should go and what the government should look like, and immediately started to form up these teams that engaged in this partisan warfare, essentially, that almost brought the country down. And you saw that again in the 1850s and again in the 1890s, and you see it again today. So political polarization takes this strategic teamsmanship form. But at another level, or another layer of polarization, is that you also increasingly today see it among citizens. So we sort ourselves out by political affiliation and by partisan affiliation, who we live with, who we work with, who we go to school with. Increasingly, we're sorting ourselves out politically. And people are motivated increasingly by what political scientists call negative partisanship, the idea that people are extremely motivated by their dislike for the other side as much or more than their affinity for their own side. Polarization doesn't necessarily entail racial conflict, but there have been moments in history when what we call conflict over membership in the community, disagreement about which groups count as full members of society and are accorded full status and full rights, and which other groups are sort of on the outside, that usually expresses itself in the United States as conflict over race or immigration. When polarization, political and partisan polarization, have coincided with conflict over race, as in the 1850s and the 1890s, and again today, that's a particularly explosive combination. So it's not inherent in the idea of polarization, a combination that's dangerous.
The one that is perhaps a little bit different in this framework we've just been talking about is the use of executive power. And I think you trace this starting to FDR, if I recall correctly, which is perhaps a little bit of a different take than the conventional wisdom of how that period of history is thought about or taught in schools and such.
Yeah, this is very much a story of the 20th century. And obviously, the growth of the presidency and the expansion of presidential power begins before Franklin Roosevelt. But you're right, we start the story with Roosevelt, who takes power. It's important to recall that Roosevelt takes power in a moment of deep, deep crisis of democracy. Democracies are crumbling in Europe. It's the bottom of the trough of the Depression in March of 1933. And people are looking to him to be the savior of liberal democracy in the United States and in the West. And he begins his presidency with an extraordinary act of presidential power. So this becomes the template for later presidents as the national security state develops over the middle of the late 20th century, as the intelligence services expand. It gives presidents an extraordinary toolkit to use to turn into a weapon for their own political purposes, and which is exactly what Richard Nixon does in Watergate and the associated scandals in the 1970s. The executive aggrandizement didn't begin with Franklin Roosevelt, but he's really a key part of the story.
So I talked about how the model our government uses had two factors that were highly predictive of civil wars. The first was anocracy. The second was whether citizens in countries that are anocracies had organized themselves into political parties based on identity rather than ideology. So rather than joining a political party because you're a conservative or a liberal, communist or a capitalist, you're joining a political party because you're black or white, Muslim or Christian, Serb or Croat. If a country had these two features, so its government was an anocracy and it had these very strong racially, ethnically, or religiously based parties, the task force considered it at high risk of civil war or ethnic conflict, and it put it on a watch list. Okay, so we know those two features. The second important point to make is that we actually know who tends to start civil wars, and it's not the people who most of us think. It's not the poorest or the weakest groups. It's actually the groups that had once been politically dominant and are in decline. Now, that's sort of background to answering your question, which is this demographic transition that the United States is facing. The group that had been politically dominant in this country and is in decline are white, predominantly male, predominantly Christians. The United States, from our inception, has been dominated by that demographic. And they have been losing status. Their status was extremely high. It was privileged compared to everybody else, but they perceive it as if they are, in fact, in decline. So if you think back to January 6th and if you remember videos from that day, the people who stormed the U.S. Capitol, they walked down the mall. They were not trying to hide. They didn't have masks on. They were taking videotapes. They were videotaping themselves with their phones. They believed they were patriots, that they were doing the right thing, and that it was their duty, actually, to take back their country. That is the kind of the perfect visual of the types of groups who feel justified in turning to violence if they're losing power.
Recall the threats that Robert and Barbara presented here. I'll give you a moment to remember. Those threats were political polarization, racial inequality, economic inequality, executive aggrandizement, and civil war in the form of insurgency. Take a moment to reflect in the comments below. Have you seen these signs in our democracy? What do you believe the state of our democracy is? Are we in peril? Let's hear one last time from Anne and Robert, who give us some hope about what we can do to keep democracy from peril.
I wanted to leave you with the reflection that history is always radically open, and that nothing is inevitable. Neither decline is inevitable. There is no reason why either the United States or Western Europe or Eastern Europe have to decline. There's no reason why our civilization needs to end. But nor is there any reason why it will definitely succeed. There is no, there's nothing magic about our form of democracy or our form of civilization. It too can come to an end. And the difference between it succeeding or failing is, of course, a million different decisions taken by people like you, people in this audience who are interested, who are active citizens, and participating in democracy, in local democracy, in regional democracy, in state democracy, or joining political institutions or even non-political institutions that put you in contact with your fellow citizens. This is a really important civic act. We should think about it as something that we all have to participate in, that we will have to make some effort if we wanted to succeed in the future, and if we want to prevent the disappointment and the radicalization of some of our fellow citizens from dominating our political discourse and from changing the nature of our country.
I think what people can focus on and think about are these pillars: free and fair elections, the rule of law, the legitimacy of the opposition, and the integrity of rights. So thinking about how candidates or policy proposals or parties are addressing these issues, thinking about whether making this or that move or selecting this or that candidate or this or that policy will advance or retard those things, I think is the most productive way that people can think about this problem.
I think we made a pretty clear case today that democracy is in peril, and that this is a part of a cycle that has identifiable signs about where we are in that cycle. However, you may not believe the same, so please comment below some of your thoughts after hearing today's lesson. I'd also like to know what sort of questions have been brought up for you around democracy or around the topics that were talked about today. We also have a poll going over on our community tab for the channel about which lessons to create next. So please take the time and go vote over there. And if the questions or the topics that you want to explore next aren't in that poll, then please leave a comment there and we'll be sure to include it in the next poll. Thank you so much for your time and attention.